With all the importance put on hooks in React, you might wonder, how do I actually write custom hooks myself? You certainly leverage them in a lot of the NPM libraries you use, but it might not be straightforward on how to actually write your own custom hooks. So I wanted to go over a really quick example and sort of explain when you would want to start writing your own custom hooks. So I just created a brand new React app with create React app and just deleted some of the boilerplate here, and I have it running here, and we'll just maybe add some basic stuff here. We're going to create a Pokemon app. So if I go here, refresh, here's our Pokemon app. And we're going to leverage this API. It's pokeapi.co. They have a nice public API that you can use to query information from Pokemon. So let's say we want a page where we can just show a Pokemon by ID. So let's go ahead and build that. I'm actually going to create a new folder here for my components just to organize, and I'm going to create main.js. So we want to import React from React, and we'll say const main equals fat arrow. Oops, keep missing the equal sign there. And then we're just going to return, for now, we'll actually return a main element. And we'll have like, let's say an H3 here, and we'll say get a Pokemon. So let's export default main. And now from app.js, we're going to import that. So let's import main. And that's what we're going to render here. So we're going to do all of our logic in here. Let's just make sure this is appearing. Get a Pokemon. Okay, so what do we want to do? We want to render information about a Pokemon that we're querying right now. So we want that Pokemon object, right? It's a big JSON object, to persist between renders. So that's going to be a stateful object. So we're going to leverage useState here. So const Pokemon and set Pokemon equals useState. I thought it would have imported this for me, but it didn't. Okay, and we're also going to leverage useEffect. So right now, we're going to write a really basic example, which is just fetch the Pokemon when the component mounts. So we'll say useEffect, and we're going to just leverage fetch. That's a browser API, and for now, again, I'm just going to hard code this. We'll make it dynamic in a second. So we're going to make a GET request. So if you don't pass any options to fetch by default, it's just going to be a GET request with some basic headers. Then we're going to look at the response. We get a response object back. The thing about useEffects is the function that gets passed to them. So the function that gets called when certain observable things change. So in this case, we're just observing when the component gets mounted. Right, that's what happens if we pass nothing to our dependencies here. This function cannot be asynchronous, but you can leverage promises in here, right? So I can do .then, I just can't do async await. So we're going to fetch this. Then when we get the response back, so the response object that comes back from fetch isn't actually the data itself. It's the response that has a lot of information like the status. What we want to now get is the JSON. So JSON is a function on response that also returns a promise that gives us the actual data that we want back. So let's just for now console log that data and see what happens. So let's go back here and let's bring up our terminal. So if I just refresh here, we'll see it get logged. And the first thing you might notice is that it's getting logged twice. And this is a known thing in React 18. So that's the latest version that's out right now. This only happens in development mode as they're making some changes to the APIs behind the scenes. So this won't actually happen in production, but it's happening because we're running the app in strict mode. So if let's say I just deleted these two things here, and we're just going to render the app, and I refresh, we only see it get logged once. We're going to leave it in strict mode for performance purposes. And again, just remember that this double logging only happens in development mode. When we actually ship to production, it's not going to happen. So I'm not going to worry too much about it right now. So we got our Pokemon JSON object here, and this has all the information that we saw here. Now we can access that. So let's actually set this as our Pokemon object, right? So we got the response back, and now we're just going to say set Pokemon to the data. And now I want to actually render that Pokemon's information out here. So maybe h4 will say Pokemon dot, let's see, how do I get its name? Oh, it's just name. Dot name, and let's render an image. Looks like sprites. We'll say front default. So we'll do image, and the source equals Pokemon.front default. And let's just save that. If we come back here, we get an error reading name. Type error cannot read properties of undefined. So the reason for that is it's an asynchronous promise. It takes a moment for it to make that request to the API, get the response back. However, React still wanted to render the content here, right? So there's a couple ways we can handle this. We can just wrap this in a conditional and say, all right, only if we have a Pokemon should you render a Pokemon. Or we can render a loading state, and if it's loading, we'll say the word loading, and if it's not, then we'll actually render the Pokemon. So let's try doing that. Let's do is loading. Again, this is going to be a set stateful variable, and set is loading. useState, and we'll say true. By default, we are in a state of loading. So we'll say here, if is loading, then we'll have some text here that says loading ... Otherwise, we will render this stuff. And it wants this to be in a fragment or something. So we'll just put it in a div for now. There we go. So it's just a ternary. If is loading, we do this. And maybe I can break this onto multiple lines. Else we are going to render the div that has the Pokemon. So when we do our load effect, we'll say set is loading to true. And then when we get our Pokemon back, we'll set is loading to false. So let's go here. Now if I refresh, you'll see loading. It flashes very, very briefly. It's a pretty quick response, but then we get Bulbasaur. Looks like my image is not loading. Why is that? Pokemon.sprites. Front default. There. And now we got our Bulbasaur. Awesome. So that's really easy for hard coding it. Now let's say we actually want to make this piece dynamic. We want it to accept an ID and fetch the appropriate Pokemon. So again, we're going to use a stateful variable here. So we're going to do page and set page, and we're going to say use state and equal to 1. So now our useEffect is actually going to observe page, and anytime that changes, we're going to do a different request here. But now we need to make this a template string because it's going to have a dynamic piece to it. So instead of this ID, we're going to grab the page. So if I just save this, it should do exactly what it did before, because again, we're defaulting to the value of 1 here, right? So if I refresh, we get loading, we get Bulbasaur. But let's say we add a button down at the bottom that says next Pokemon. And on click, we will call a function. We will set page to be page +1. All right, so now we want to click next Pokemon. We get Ivysaur, Venusaur, and I can just keep incrementing this up. Okay, so really, really basic example there, working with a real API, getting some asynchronous data. So how would we extract this to a custom hook? Well, hooks are just functions. That's the biggest thing to remember. A hook is a function, and a custom hook is a function that leverages one of the hooks provided by React. So that's the difference between you just writing a util function and you writing a custom hook. So we're going to write a custom hook. I'm just going to throw it in my components folder for now. It's probably not the best place to put it, but we're just going to call it use Pokemon.js. So what do we need here? Well, we need everything that we leveraged from React, which would be useEffect and useState. So we're going to grab those, import useEffect, useState from React. Then we're going to have our function. So const use Pokemon, and that's going to accept an ID. So that's the remember that page number. I probably should have called it ID, but yeah, that corresponds to, like, 1 is Bulbasaur, 2 is Ivysaur, etc. So we're going to copy over this, the Pokemon stuff, right? So set Pokemon, and Pokemon is a stateful variable, and we're going to grab our useEffect here, as well as our loading objects, loading variable. So this actually isn't page anymore, it's now ID. So use Pokemon accepts an ID, right? And anytime that ID changes, we are going to call this logic. We're going to make a request to that API. When the response comes back, we're going to get the JSON. We're going to save the data from that JSON as our Pokemon. And then the hook itself needs to return something to the consuming component. So in this case, I want to return both the Pokemon and whether or not we are loading that Pokemon. So we're going to say return, and I'm going to return it as an array, Pokemon and is loading. So this is like what useState does. It returns an array. And the reason you would want to do this is because you can do this here, which is destructuring an array, right? So Pokemon here is what I'm naming the variable that is returned as the 0 index of the array returned by useState. And that's useful because I can then name these variables anything I want, versus, returning an object. I would have to use the key Pokemon and the key is loading. But I want the people that use my custom hook here to be able to call those variables whatever they want. And we're going to export default use Pokemon. Okay, so we have our custom hook. So let's actually import that in. We're going to import use Pokemon from this. Now we can delete all of this logic, and we're going to say, const Pokemon and is loading equals use Pokemon, and we're going to pass it the page. So now if I save that, we refresh here, we have the same exact logic, but now we're leveraging a custom hook. And we could even add another button here. Let's say back Pokemon. This would be Pokemon -1. We refresh. Now I can go up all the way to Squirtle. Now I can go back down. Obviously, we're not guarding against numbers less than 0, etc. But we handled all the loading logic and the stateful Pokemon logic through our custom hook. And then the consuming component only has to call this one thing, and our hook takes care of observing the ID, handling the asynchronous behavior. We could also add logic here around catching errors. Maybe we return an error. So you might be wondering, okay, when do I actually write my own custom hook? The most common example, or the most common thing that would probably come to mind, is if I'm repeating this logic. So if this is a hook I'm using all over the place, or if this is a function I'm calling all over the place, I should abstract it to a hook. That way, multiple components can leverage it. That, I would say, again, is probably the most obvious case. I would say you don't have to write a custom hook just because it gets used in a lot of places. I think even if this was the only component that used this, I think this is still a good candidate for a custom hook. So if you have a lot of logic in place, like a lot of logic of making a request to an API, saving stateful data as to whether or not it's loading, parsing the JSON response, but the template itself only cares about one thing, which in essence it sort of does. It only cares about the Pokemon. That is a good candidate for abstracting to a hook and keeping your components really only worrying about the logic around rendering, the actual template itself, and abstracting all the logic around handling the data to a hook. Because you can imagine if you have more stuff, or, you know, fetching multiple Pokemon, or maybe we're fetching abilities for Pokemon and stuff, this component could really grow in size. So even though it's the only component that might worry about those things, you have a lot of sort of unrelated logic, but the template itself might only care about one or two keys in an object. So again, I would say if your template is really simple, but you have a lot of logic here, think about abstracting to a custom hook. And again, a custom hook, it's just a function, but it leverages the lifecycle hooks that we get from React. Otherwise, you're just writing a function. Slapping use at the front, that's just a convention, but it is, again, a way, kind of an agreed upon convention in a way to flag to React that this is a custom hook, and it's going to leverage something like useEffect, useState, useCallback, useMemo, etc. Obviously, they can become really complicated. You can abstract a lot of logic out of your components into these custom hooks. So hopefully you found this helpful. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment.